They found the erased village of Appalachia in 1949. The diaries revealed what the world ignored. In the dense mountains of West Virginia, where fog clings to ancient trees like forbidden secrets, a team of state surveyors stumbled upon something that would haunt American history forever. What they discovered in those isolated hollows wasn't just a forgotten community. It was evidence of humanity's darkest family practices, preserved in handwritten diaries that documented generations of bloodline preservation at any cost. September 1949. 3 men from the West Virginia Land Survey Department pushed through overgrown trails near the Virginia border, mapping territory that official records claimed was uninhabited wilderness. Lead surveyor Robert Mitchell, accompanied by assistant cartographers James Thornton and David Hayes, expected nothing more than routine measurements and soil samples. The morning air was thick with moisture, and autumn leaves created a carpet of gold and crimson beneath their boots as they ventured deeper into terrain no government official had visited in decades. Around midday, Mitchell noticed something irregular. Wooden structures barely visible through the vegetation, their weathered boards blending seamlessly with the surrounding forest. As the team approached, the true scope of their discovery became clear. An entire settlement lay before them, approximately 40 dwellings arranged in a crude semicircle around a central clearing. The buildings showed signs of recent abandonment, doors hanging open, personal belongings scattered inside homes, cooking pots still containing remnants of meals. But it was the people themselves who stopped the surveyors in their tracks. Emerging from the tree line came a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, though her facial features suggested something profoundly wrong. Her eyes sat unnaturally close together, her jaw protruded at an awkward angle, and her movements were uncoordinated, almost childlike. Behind her, more residents appeared, each displaying physical characteristics that Mitchell would later describe in his official report as severe developmental abnormalities consistent with prolonged genetic isolation. The community called themselves the Hollow Creek people, descendants of 3 families, the Caldwells, the Pritchards, and the Morgans, who had settled this remote valley in 1847. What began as a legitimate farming community had, over the course of a century, transformed into something else entirely. Through a combination of geographical isolation and deliberate choices to keep bloodlines pure, these families had intermarried exclusively among themselves for 5 generations. Elder Thomas Caldwell, 73 years old, and the community's unofficial leader, approached the surveyors with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. His speech was slow and labored, his words emerging with difficulty through a palate that hadn't formed correctly. Despite his physical challenges, Thomas possessed a sharp awareness of his community's situation. He had kept detailed records, diaries, birth registries, and family trees, documenting everything that had transpired in Hollow Creek since his grandfather's time. Mitchell and his team spent 3 days in the settlement, initially gathering geographical data, but increasingly focused on understanding the human tragedy before them. They counted 47 residents ranging from infants to elderly individuals. Not a single person appeared physically normal by conventional standards. The children displayed the most severe conditions. Some couldn't walk properly, others struggled with basic communication, and several showed signs of significant intellectual limitations that made independent living impossible. The surveyors learned that Hollow Creek had once maintained limited contact with the outside world. Until the early 1900s, occasional traders had visited, and a few families had permitted marriages with outsiders. But a series of events, including a devastating influenza outbreak in 1918 that the community blamed on external contact, and growing shame about their children's increasingly visible differences, led to complete isolation. By 1925, Hollow Creek had essentially sealed itself off from American society. Thomas showed Mitchell the community's most precious and disturbing artifact, a leather-bound journal begun by his grandfather, Jeremiah Caldwell, in 1882. The entries documented weddings between first cousins, unions between uncles and nieces, and eventually, as the population dwindled and options narrowed, even closer relations. Jeremiah had recorded his growing horror as each generation produced children with more severe physical and mental challenges, yet the community continued the practice, bound by tradition, religious conviction, and fear of contamination from the outside world. The diary entries were matter-of-fact and heartbreaking. June 1891, Elizabeth Pritchard, born to Samuel and his cousin Martha. Child cannot hold her head steady. We pray she grows stronger. March 1898, young Thomas Morgan passed on, aged 7. He never learned to speak. The Lord's will remains mysterious to us. December 1903, another winter claims 2 infants. Sister Agnes says we are being tested for our faith. As Mitchell read these accounts by lamplight in one of the settlement's less damaged structures, he understood he wasn't just documenting a geographical anomaly. He was witnessing the consequences of genetic isolation pushed to its absolute extreme, a living laboratory of what happens when human bloodlines collapse inward upon themselves, generation after generation, creating a cascade of inherited conditions that medical science was only beginning to understand. On their final evening in Hollow Creek, a young woman named Sarah Pritchard approached Mitchell privately. Unlike many residents, Sarah could speak clearly, though her twisted spine forced her to walk with a pronounced limp. She pressed a small bundle of letters into his hands, correspondence between her grandmother and a sister who had escaped to Charleston in 1923, severing all family ties to avoid the fate that had befallen Hollow Creek. "Tell people what happened here," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her asymmetrical face. "Don't let them forget us. Don't let them think this was God's plan or natural isolation. People made choices. My great-grandfather chose to marry his brother's daughter because he said it kept the land in the family. My grandfather chose to marry his cousin because he said outsiders would corrupt us. Every generation chose this, and every generation paid the price. We're not just sick. We're the evidence of what happens when fear and pride matter more than children's futures. Confira-se já é inscrito neste canal, because these suppressed stories of America's hidden communities deserve to be told, and you need to hear what history tried to erase. When Mitchell's team returned to Charleston with their findings, the state government faced an immediate crisis. The existence of Hollow Creek wasn't just a social welfare issue, it was a public embarrassment that revealed how thoroughly certain populations had been neglected and forgotten. Within weeks, a larger expedition was organized, including medical professionals, social workers, and a documentary photographer named Helen Garrison, whose images would later provide the only visual evidence of the community before it was dispersed. Dr. Marcus Wellington, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University who had studied hereditary conditions in isolated populations, joined the expedition specifically to examine Hollow Creek's genealogical records. What Thomas Caldwell showed him exceeded his worst predictions. The family trees, meticulously maintained across 5 generations, revealed a pattern of intermarriage so concentrated that by 1949, every single resident of Hollow Creek shared genetic material at levels comparable to siblings. The Caldwell-Pritchard-Morgan family tree resembled a ladder more than a branching structure. Where healthy populations spread outward with each generation, incorporating new genetic diversity through marriages with unrelated individuals, Hollow Creek's genealogy collapsed inward. First cousin marriages in the 1870s had given way to uncle-niece unions in the 1890s. By the 1920s, with the population aging and options limited, the community had seen unions between individuals who shared grandparents, genetic relationships so close that their children faced catastrophic odds of inheriting multiple copies of damaging recessive genes. Dr. Wellington conducted medical examinations with the community's reluctant permission. His findings were documented in a report that would remain classified for 30 years due to its sensitive nature. Of the 47 residents, 43 displayed what he termed significant genetic burden, physical and developmental conditions directly attributable to inbreeding depression. Common conditions included cleft palates, club feet, microcephaly, severe scoliosis, intellectual disabilities ranging from mild to profound, and various heart defects that had claimed numerous lives in infancy and childhood. But the most disturbing finding wasn't the presence of these conditions. It was their progression across generations. Wellington's analysis showed that each successive generation of Hollow Creek children experienced worse outcomes than their parents. The first generation born from cousin marriages in the 1870s had relatively mild issues, slightly increased rates of childhood illness, some minor physical differences. By the fourth generation in the 1920s, infant mortality had reached 70%, and survivors frequently required lifelong care for multiple severe disabilities. The diaries provided heartbreaking context to these clinical observations. Entries from different authors across different decades revealed the community's growing awareness of their situation, coupled with an inability or unwillingness to change course. Jeremiah Caldwell's 1885 entry noted, "The children seem frailer than in our youth, more prone to sickness and deformity. Some whisper that our way of keeping families close has brought this curse, but Elder Morgan preaches that we must maintain purity and trust in providence." By 1912, the tone had shifted to desperation. Martha Pritchard wrote, "We buried 3 babies this winter, none living past 6 months. Every cradle becomes a coffin. The women weep and pray, but the births continue and the deaths continue, and we are trapped in a cycle we cannot break. Those who speak of bringing in outsiders are called faithless and cast out." The most detailed account came from Thomas Caldwell himself, writing in 1938 when he was in his early 60s. His entry provided crucial insight into why the community persisted in their isolation despite overwhelming evidence of its consequences. "I have lived long enough to see 4 generations suffer for the sins of the first. My own children, born of my union with cousin Rebecca, bear the marks of our folly, crooked spines, twisted limbs, minds that never fully awakened. I know what we have done. I understand the science now, having read the medical journals that Trader Johnson brought in 1903 before we sent him away for good. We are poisoning our own blood, concentrating defects that should have been diluted across wider populations. But what choice remains to us now? We are marked people. The outside world looks at our children and sees monsters, abominations." In 1926, when young Michael Pritchard ventured to the nearest town, seeking medical help for his daughter, they called authorities. The girl was taken, placed in an institution, and Michael never saw her again. We learned then that the world outside has no mercy for those who carry the evidence of our mistakes in their very flesh. We stay hidden because we are ashamed. We continue as we are because we are already damned. To bring in outsiders now would be to admit everything, to expose our children to a society that would institutionalize them, sterilize them, erase them from existence in the name of public health and genetic hygiene. So we persist in our isolated valley, tending our sick, burying our dead, and praying that God forgives what we cannot fix. Dr. Wellington recognized that Hollow Creek represented an extreme case, but not a unique one. Throughout Appalachia and other isolated regions, small communities with limited genetic diversity had experienced similar, if less severe, consequences. What made Hollow Creek exceptional was the completeness of its isolation and the documentation of its decline. Social worker Eleanor Ross interviewed the women of Hollow Creek separately, seeking to understand the female perspective on the community's reproductive practices. What emerged was a picture of profound resignation mixed with protective maternal instinct. These women knew their children would likely be born with serious health problems. They understood that each pregnancy carried enormous risk, yet they continued bearing children because, as one woman explained, a child with troubles is still a child. A mother who stops trying is already dead inside. The women's stories revealed another dimension of Hollow Creek's tragedy, the complete absence of reproductive choice. In a community governed by rigid religious traditions and patriarchal authority, women had no power to refuse marriages arranged by elders or to prevent pregnancies that they knew would likely end in heartbreak. Several women had attempted to leave over the decades, but with no education, no money, and children who would be immediately recognizable as different in any outside community, escape proved impossible. Helen Garrison's photographs captured the human reality behind the statistics and genealogies. Her images showed children with severe physical differences sitting on porch steps, their expressions revealing intelligence and awareness, trapped in bodies that hadn't developed correctly. She photographed elderly residents whose faces displayed the cumulative effects of generations of genetic concentration, features that deviated so far from typical human variation that viewers would later struggle to process what they were seeing. But Garrison also captured moments of tenderness and community, mothers cradling children with profound disabilities, neighbors helping each other with daily tasks, residents gathered for meals where they supported those who struggled to feed themselves. These images complicated the narrative, showing that even in the most dire circumstances of genetic catastrophe, human connection and care persisted. As the expedition prepared to leave Hollow Creek for the second time, now with comprehensive documentation of the community's genetic collapse, Dr. Wellington faced an ethical dilemma. His scientific responsibility demanded that he publish his findings. Hollow Creek provided unprecedented data about inbreeding depression in humans, information that could inform genetic counseling and public health policy. But publishing would expose these people to public scrutiny, ridicule, and potential forced interventions by a society that had, in recent decades, embraced eugenics policies, including forced sterilization of those deemed genetically unfit. The decision about Hollow Creek's fate was made in closed-door meetings in Charleston and Washington, D.C., involving state officials, federal health authorities, and representatives from several universities. The consensus reached in early 1950 was as pragmatic as it was morally troubling. Hollow Creek would be humanely dissolved and its existence largely erased from public record. The plan unfolded over 18 months. Residents were offered relocation assistance, with younger individuals encouraged to move to larger towns where they could access better medical care and, theoretically, integrate into broader society. Older residents and those with the most severe disabilities were transferred to state institutions, specifically designed for long-term care of individuals with developmental and physical challenges. Thomas Caldwell, now 74 and in failing health, fought the dissolution with every resource at his disposal. He argued that despite their problems, Hollow Creek had functioned as a community where everyone had a place and a purpose. He warned that separating residents would condemn them to lives as isolated individuals in a society that feared and misunderstood them. His protests were noted, sympathized with, and ultimately ignored. By summer 1951, Hollow Creek stood empty. The buildings were demolished to prevent anyone from attempting to return, and the land was absorbed into a newly designated state forest. Official records were altered to minimize the community's existence. Census data was adjusted, birth records were restricted, and the surveyor's initial reports were classified under public health confidentiality laws. The residents scattered across West Virginia and neighboring states met varied fates. Some of the younger individuals with less severe physical differences managed to find work and establish independent lives, though they uniformly chose to hide their origins. The majority ended up in institutions, not the cruel warehouses of earlier decades, but still places of confinement where they lived separated from mainstream society until their deaths. Dr. Wellington's comprehensive study remained unpublished during his lifetime. When portions finally appeared in medical literature in the 1970s, all identifying information had been removed, and Hollow Creek was referred to only as Population A, an isolated Appalachian community. The genetic data proved valuable for understanding recessive inheritance patterns, but the human story behind those patterns remained suppressed. The diaries that Thomas Caldwell had maintained were confiscated as part of the community's dissolution. They were stored in a state archive with access restricted to researchers with specific authorization. For decades they gathered dust, their testimonies unread, their warnings unheeded. However, Sarah Pritchard, the young woman who had given letters to Surveyor Mitchell, managed to preserve one crucial document before the dispersal, her grandmother's personal diary from 1920 to 1945. Sarah had been relocated to a group home in Charleston, where she worked in the facility's laundry despite her physical limitations. She kept the diary hidden, reading it in private moments, drawing strength from her grandmother's unflinching honesty about Hollow Creek's decline. In 1967, Sarah contacted a journalist named Raymond Foster, who had written sympathetically about Appalachian poverty and neglect. She was 51 years old, her health declining from the cumulative effects of her genetic inheritance and a hard life of manual labor. She told Foster that she was dying and wanted the truth about Hollow Creek documented before the last witnesses were gone. Foster spent 6 months interviewing Sarah and tracking down other survivors. He found 12 individuals still living who had been Hollow Creek residents in 1949. Most were in institutions or supervised living facilities, several had died in the intervening years, and all carried physical evidence of their origins. Their collective testimony, combined with Sarah's grandmother's diary, formed the basis for a series of newspaper articles that Foster published in 1968. The articles caused a brief sensation. Headlines proclaimed America's hidden genetic disaster and the village that inbreeding destroyed. But the coverage quickly took a sensationalistic turn that horrified Sarah and the other survivors. Photographs were published without consent. Individuals were described in dehumanizing terms, and the coverage focused on the shocking aspects rather than the systemic failures that had allowed Hollow Creek to exist in such isolation. Public reactions split along predictable lines. Some demanded investigations into how state and federal governments had failed to identify and intervene in Hollow Creek earlier. Others used the story to advocate for stronger eugenics policies, arguing that Hollow Creek demonstrated why certain populations should be prevented from reproducing. Very few voices emphasized what Sarah had hoped to convey, that Hollow Creek's tragedy was fundamentally about choices made by specific individuals across generations, choices influenced by poverty, isolation, religious extremism, and social shame. At this point in our story, I want you to think about something Sarah said in her final interview with Foster. She looked directly at the camera and stated, "We were not animals or monsters. We were people failed by every system that should have protected us." If those words resonated with you, leave a comment with that exact phrase. We were not animals or monsters. We were people failed by every system that should have protected us. Let's honor Sarah's memory and ensure this story reaches everyone who needs to hear it. The genetic analysis of Hollow Creek eventually contributed to important advances in understanding hereditary disease and the risks of consanguinity. By the 1980s, with the rise of modern genetic testing and counseling, researchers returned to the Hollow Creek data with new tools and perspectives. Dr. Jennifer Lawson, a geneticist specializing in population genetics at the University of Virginia, obtained permission to analyze blood samples that had been collected from Hollow Creek residents in 1950 and preserved for research purposes. Her 1989 study, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, provided the first comprehensive genetic analysis of an inbred human population with such complete genealogical records. Lawson's findings confirmed what Dr. Wellington had suspected 4 decades earlier. The Hollow Creek population had suffered from severe inbreeding depression, with genomic analysis revealing that residents carried, on average, long continuous stretches of identical DNA sequences, a marker of parental relatedness. Many individuals were homozygous for recessive alleles that would be extremely rare in outbred populations, explaining the high incidence of genetic disorders. But Lawson's work also revealed something unexpected: genetic resilience in certain lineages. A few families within Hollow Creek had, by chance, avoided the worst genetic combinations. Their descendants, while still affected by the overall population structure, had slightly better health outcomes. This finding suggested that even in populations experiencing severe inbreeding depression, some genetic variation persisted, offering theoretical possibilities for recovery if isolation could be broken. The practical implications extended beyond academic interest. Lawson's work informed genetic counseling protocols for communities at risk of consanguinity-related problems, particularly immigrant populations from cultures where cousin marriage was traditional. Rather than simply warning against such unions, counselors could now quantify risks and explain the cumulative effects of repeated close-kin marriages across generations. Meanwhile, the institutional survivors of Hollow Creek were aging. By 1990, only 3 individuals confirmed to have been born in Hollow Creek before its dissolution remained alive. The youngest, Martha Morgan, had been an infant in 1949 and had spent her entire life in supervised care facilities. She had severe intellectual disabilities resulting from her genetic inheritance, but had developed a surprising talent for music, playing piano by ear with remarkable skill despite her other limitations. A documentary filmmaker, Patricia Brennan, sought to tell Martha's story as a way of humanizing the Hollow Creek legacy. The resulting film, The Last of Hollow Creek, premiered in 1995 at several film festivals. It presented Martha not as a victim or scientific curiosity, but as a complete person, someone who experienced joy through music, maintained friendships with facility staff, and had a life worth living despite the circumstances of her birth. The documentary included interviews with the few remaining individuals who had direct knowledge of Hollow Creek. Dr. Wellington, now 93 and in declining health, appeared on camera for the first time to discuss his 1949 expedition. His perspective had evolved significantly over the decades. "When I first encountered Hollow Creek," Wellington reflected, "I saw it primarily as a scientific opportunity, a chance to study inbreeding effects in a controlled population. Only later did I understand that I had witnessed a profound human tragedy, one that couldn't be reduced to data and statistics. These were people trapped by decisions made generations before their birth, people who deserved compassion and assistance rather than the mixture of fascination and disgust that society showed them." Wellington revealed that he had fought unsuccessfully against the decision to disperse the community, arguing instead for in-place support that would have allowed residents to remain together while receiving medical care and education. "We didn't save them," he said bitterly. "We erased them because they embarrassed us, because they revealed uncomfortable truths about poverty and neglect in rural America. and because it was easier to scatter them to institutions than to acknowledge our failure to help them when intervention might have actually mattered. The documentary also included testimony from descendants of those who had left Hollow Creek before its final isolation. These individuals, scattered across the country, had largely hidden their family origins. Many had only learned about Hollow Creek from news coverage in the 1960s, discovering that the mysterious bad blood their parents or grandparents had fled from had a name and a documented history. One descendant, Robert Caldwell Jr., grandson of a man who had left Hollow Creek in 1923, spoke about the intergenerational trauma of genetic shame. "My grandfather never spoke about where he came from. He took his secrets to the grave. But I inherited his fear, an irrational terror of genetic disease, an obsession with ensuring my children married people from completely unrelated backgrounds. Only when I learned about Hollow Creek did I understand why he was so haunted. He escaped physically, but the knowledge of what he'd left behind, what might be in his own genes, tormented him forever." Patricia Brennan's documentary achieved what Raymond Foster's newspaper articles had not. It shifted public conversation toward empathy and systemic analysis rather than sensation and judgment. Viewers were confronted with the reality that genetic disasters like Hollow Creek resulted from failures of education, healthcare access, economic development, and social support, not from some inherent moral deficiency in the people themselves. Martha Morgan died in 2003 at the age of 54, the last person born in Hollow Creek before its dissolution. Her death marked the end of living memory of the community as it had existed, though its legacy continued through genetic data, historical records, and the scattered descendants of those who had escaped or been dispersed. In the years following Martha's death, researchers and historians returned to the Hollow Creek materials with fresh perspectives. A 2010 historical analysis by Dr. Samuel Richards at Appalachian State University contextualized Hollow Creek within the broader pattern of isolated communities throughout American history. Richards demonstrated that Hollow Creek was exceptional in its extremity, but not unique in kind. Dozens of isolated settlements in various mountain and desert regions had experienced similar, if less dramatic, genetic bottlenecks. What distinguished Hollow Creek was the completeness of its documentation and the willful blindness of authorities who could have intervened much earlier. Census takers had visited the area sporadically through the 1930s and noted abnormalities among the population, but filed no reports triggering investigation or assistance. A traveling doctor who had passed through in 1927 had written to state health authorities about concerning hereditary patterns, but received no response. Richards argued that Hollow Creek represented a failure of the social contract, a situation where geographic isolation combined with official indifference created conditions for a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded over decades. The community had been poor, uneducated, and disconnected from political power, making it easy to ignore until the situation became too extreme to overlook. The most significant recent development in the Hollow Creek story came in 2015, when the West Virginia State Archives finally opened the complete collection of confiscated diaries to unrestricted research. Graduate student Linda Patterson spent 2 years reading through thousands of pages of handwritten testimony, creating a comprehensive picture of daily life in Hollow Creek across 5 generations. Patterson's doctoral dissertation, later published as the book Hollow Creek, An American Tragedy of Blood and Silence, provided the most complete account yet of how the community functioned, how residents understood their situation, and how they maintained social cohesion despite overwhelming challenges. The diaries revealed unexpected complexity. Hollow Creek residents weren't ignorant of the risks they faced. Many entries showed awareness that close-kin marriages produced unhealthy children, but they felt trapped by multiple forces: religious teachings that emphasized family purity and divine will, economic circumstances that made it impossible to relocate, social shame that prevented them from seeking outside help, and ultimately, a tragic momentum where each generation's choices constrained the next generation's options even further. One diary entry written by Martha Pritchard in 1942 captured the essence of this trap. "We are drowning in the choices of our grandparents, choices that seemed reasonable to them: keep the land together, maintain the faith, protect our children from a corrupting world. Each decision seemed small, defensible. Marry this cousin rather than travel for a stranger. Have children despite the risks because faith demands it. Stay isolated because the outside world mocks what we've become." But small choices compound across generations until they become an inescapable cage built from our own flesh and blood. Patterson's work also documented resistance within the community. Several individuals across the generations had argued for change, proposed bringing in outsiders, or attempted to leave. Most were marginalized or expelled. A few succeeded in escaping, though they typically severed all contact with Hollow Creek, unable to reconcile their desire for normal lives with loyalty to family members who remained trapped. The book sparked renewed interest in Hollow Creek, leading to a 2018 podcast series that reached millions of listeners worldwide. The podcast, The Hollow, combined historical research with interviews with descendants and experts, creating a compelling narrative that educated audiences about the science of inbreeding while maintaining focus on the human dimensions of the story. Modern genetic researchers continue to reference Hollow Creek in studies of consanguinity risks and population genetics. The community's experience has informed public health campaigns in regions where traditional practices favor cousin marriage, providing concrete evidence of cumulative risks while avoiding the judgmental tone that often characterizes such discussions. But perhaps the most important legacy of Hollow Creek is the question it poses to contemporary society. How many communities exist right now, suffering in isolation from solvable problems, invisible to authorities, and abandoned by systems that should protect them? The specific circumstances of Hollow Creek, extreme genetic isolation leading to catastrophic health outcomes, may be rare, but the pattern of neglect, the preference for erasure over assistance, and the tendency to blame victims rather than address systemic failures remains depressingly common. Sarah Pritchard's plea in 1967, "Tell people what happened here, don't let them forget us," has been partially fulfilled. Hollow Creek is no longer erased from history. Its story has been documented, analyzed, and disseminated. But the deeper question remains whether society has truly learned the lessons that Hollow Creek offers. The genetic tragedy of Hollow Creek resulted from very specific circumstances: geographic isolation, limited population size, cultural practices favoring endogamy, and generations of consistent close-kin reproduction. But the social tragedy, the failure of institutions to identify and assist a vulnerable population, the preference for concealment over intervention, and the treatment of affected individuals as embarrassments rather than citizens deserving support, reflects patterns that continue in various forms throughout contemporary America. If you've watched this entire story, you now understand what the world tried to ignore in 1949 and for decades afterward. You've seen how small decisions can compound across generations into catastrophic outcomes, how isolation and shame create traps that individuals cannot escape alone, and how society often chooses erasure over the harder work of genuine assistance and support. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because stories like Hollow Creek need to be preserved and shared so that we recognize similar patterns before they reach crisis points. If you watched until here, it's because you connected with this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. If this investigation into America's hidden history impacted you, hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand how easily vulnerable communities can be forgotten and erased when it's more convenient than confronting uncomfortable truths. Hollow Creek is gone, but its warning remains. Isolation plus neglect plus time equals tragedy. The question we must ask ourselves is where the next Hollow Creek exists right now, suffering quietly beyond our awareness, waiting for someone to care enough to look beyond the surface and demand something better than erasure and silence.